When I saw my husband lean against the kitchen doorframe, holding the empty coffee cup I forgot to put away, I knew he had heard it, the laughter, the second voice in the living room. But it wasn't fear that made my chest tighten. It was shame. Shame that he'd notice I had started to laugh again. Not at his jokes, not at his stories, but at someone else entirely. He didn't ask who it was. He didn't look angry. Just tired. And in that moment, I realized something worse than being caught. I realized he had stopped caring long before I ever strayed. He left the cup on the counter without saying a word. I stood there, frozen, trying to decide if I should call after him or let the silence deepen, knowing it had already become the language we spoke most fluently. And this isn't the story of a wild affair or reckless betrayal. This is the story of how I lost myself, and then, unexpectedly, found a version I had buried under years of good behavior. Before I share the part of me I kept hidden even from myself, let me ask you, have you ever come to terms with the fact that your partner let go of you long before you did? And if so, what did you do with that truth? I don't remember exactly when I started feeling invisible, only that it crept up slowly, the way rust spreads on something left out in the rain. One day you're shiny and useful, and the next you're tolerated. The chair no one really sits in anymore. A presence, not a person. It wasn't always like that. There were times, earlier in the marriage, when his touch made me feel alive. When we would argue not because we were tired, but because we cared too much. That energy, passion, maybe, faded over the years like the colors of the curtains we never replaced. Now our conversations were reduced to calendar updates, utility bills, reminders. No curiosity. No looking. He hadn't looked at me in months. So when he told me his step-grandson would be staying with us for a few weeks, just until he finds a place, he said, I didn't think much of it. I didn't even ask why. That's how far gone we were. A younger man moving into our home, and I didn't feel a flicker of jealousy from him. If the roles had been reversed, I might have noticed. But he? No. It was just another logistical detail in our sterile lives. The first time I saw him, the grandson, I had just stepped out of the bathroom in my robe, not realizing anyone else was home yet. He was in the hallway, holding a box of books. We both froze. I clutched the robe a little tighter. He turned away politely. Sorry, he said, voice low. Didn't mean to startle you. No harm done, I replied, stepping quickly into the bedroom and closing the door. I stood there for a moment, heart tapping against my ribs, unsure why I was blushing. It wasn't attraction. Not then. It was embarrassment. And something else, something like being seen. Even if just for a second. Later that evening, we had dinner together. I cooked, as I usually did, not because I loved it anymore, but because it was my role. My husband scrolled through his phone. The grandson, he complimented the food. Twice. This is amazing, he said. Tastes like actual comfort. I laughed. Not because it was funny, but because I couldn't remember the last time someone reacted to something I made with anything other than it's fine. We talked a little. He asked what I used in the sauce. Asked about the garden. He told me about his classes, the temporary work he was doing nearby. He was thoughtful, expressive, a little shy, but open in a way I wasn't used to anymore. When I cleared the plates, he insisted on helping. You cooked, he said. Let me clean. It wasn't flirtation. Not even kindness, really. It was respect. Mutuality. That rare feeling that you are not just background noise. My husband went to bed early that night. He had a headache, he said. Maybe he did. Or maybe it was easier not to witness the growing warmth between two people he couldn't be bothered to understand anymore. In the days that followed, the grandson and I slipped into an odd sort of rhythm. He rose early, made strong coffee, always left a cup for me on the counter. He worked most of the day, came home tired but polite. He asked how my day was. I began to look forward to the question. I started wearing earrings again. Not big ones, just simple gold studs that used to make me feel put together. I brushed my hair even on days I didn't plan to leave the house. I told myself it was for me. Maybe it was. But part of me, the part one had silenced for so long, liked knowing someone might notice. One morning, I caught my reflection in the hallway mirror. There was a light in my eyes I hadn't seen in years. Not youth, I'm not delusional. But presence. Energy. And that scared me. Because I wasn't sure what to do with it. My husband remained distant, buried in his routines. He didn't notice the change. Or maybe he did, and simply didn't ask. One evening, I asked him if he wanted to go out to dinner. Too tired, he said without looking up. Maybe this weekend. He didn't ask why I was suddenly dressed in a blouse I hadn't worn in 2 years. He didn't even glance. So I sat at the table with our guest instead. He had brought back pastries from a cafe near his work. Thought you might like them, he said. I did. But more than that, I liked being thought of. That night, I couldn't sleep. I lay in bed beside a man who hadn't touched me in months, listening to the soft music coming from the guest room down the hall. And for the first time in a long time, I felt something awaken. Not desire, not yet. But recognition. A seed of something I didn't yet have the courage to name. I stared at the ceiling and whispered into the dark, "This is dangerous." And I wasn't wrong. The morning after that sleepless night, I moved through the kitchen like a ghost, every motion deliberate and silent. The clock ticked louder than usual, or maybe I had simply become more attuned to quiet. I poured coffee into my favorite mug, the one with the chipped handle and faint floral design, and sat at the table without checking my phone. I didn't need distractions. What I needed was clarity. He entered a few minutes later, still groggy from sleep, hair tousled and eyes soft from the kind of rest I hadn't had in years. He looked surprised to see me already awake. "You're up early," he said, rubbing the back of his neck. I nodded. "Couldn't sleep." He offered a small, knowing smile. "Same." We didn't say anything else. It wasn't uncomfortable. It was something else, something delicate and undefined. Like the moment before a raindrop falls. He made his own coffee, this time not forgetting to rinse the spoon before putting it back. It was such a small thing, but I noticed. I always noticed the small things. Later that day, I decided to work in the garage. There was a box of old decorations and photo frames I had been meaning to go through for years. It was dusty, forgotten, like so many parts of my life. I tied my hair back, put on a faded pair of gloves, and opened the door. The smell of wood and age welcomed me like an old, familiar song. I didn't hear him come in. Only felt his presence as the light shifted behind me. "Need help?" he asked. I should have said no. It was my habit to do things myself, to avoid relying on others. But instead, I hesitated and then said yes. We lifted boxes together, sorting through old wreaths and used tools, tangled strings of lights. Occasionally, he'd hold something up with a crooked smile, and I'd laugh, genuinely, not out of politeness. At one point, I slipped slightly on a loose extension cord, and before I could steady myself, he reached out and caught me by the elbow. It was just a touch. But it was enough. We both paused. My arm in his hand, his eyes locked with mine. The moment lasted longer than it should have, long enough to feel the air between us shift. I pulled away gently, brushing it off with a laugh I didn't quite believe. "Thanks," I murmured. We didn't talk much after that. The mood had changed, and we both felt it. That evening, I found myself sitting outside on the porch. The sun was low, casting long shadows over the lawn. The quiet buzz of insects filled the air, and the wind played with the hem of my dress. He came out a little while later, barefoot, carrying a book. He sat on the far end of the bench without saying anything. We existed together in the silence, and somehow, that was enough. I closed my eyes and tried to remember the last time I had felt something like this, not love, not lust, but attention. Presence. The feeling of someone truly existing beside you, not just near you. Dinner was quiet. My husband had called earlier to say he would be staying one more night at the conference. He didn't ask how things were. He never did. He told me about the meals he had, the people he met. I told him everything was fine. I didn't lie, but I didn't tell the truth either. And he didn't ask for it. After I hung up, I stayed in the kitchen longer than I needed to, pretending to clean the same spot on the counter. My hands trembled slightly, but I ignored it. He appeared again, standing at the doorway, watching me. "Everything okay?" he asked. I nodded. "Just tired." He stepped closer, hesitant. "I hope I'm not making things complicated by being here." That stopped me. I turned, met his gaze. "Why would you say that?" He looked down. "I don't know. Just a feeling." We stood there, the space between us buzzing with unsaid things. "I don't blame you," I said softly. "For anything." He took another step toward me. And then we kissed. It wasn't planned. It wasn't a declaration. It just happened. A second passed. Then another. When we parted, neither of us spoke. He left the room first. I stood there for a long time, staring at the floor, at the spot where our shadows had briefly overlapped. That night, I lay in bed fully awake, the ceiling above me a blank canvas for the chaos in my mind. I heard a door creak softly down the hall, but no footsteps. I didn't move. In the stillness, I thought about the kiss. Not its meaning, that was still unclear, but the fact that it had happened. The way my body had remembered something I thought it had forgotten. The way my heart had reacted like a frightened animal, trying to run and reach for something at the same time. I wasn't proud. I wasn't ashamed either. I was something in between. A woman suspended in the middle of a truth she hadn't been ready to face. I had kissed someone who wasn't my husband. And for the first time in years, I felt awake. The next morning, I avoided the kitchen. I didn't want to face the mug on the counter or the silence that would settle between us again like dust on unused shelves. Instead, I stayed in my room longer than usual, pretending to read, but not turning a single page. My hands rested on the closed book, eyes fixed on nothing in particular. My thoughts spiraled. I replayed the moment in my mind again and again, not the kiss itself, but everything before and after. The way he had looked at me. The hesitation. The guilt. And then the quiet that followed, heavy with things neither of us knew how to say. I hadn't slept much, though I'd kept my eyes closed for hours, hoping the darkness might silence the noise in my chest. Eventually, hunger pulled me out of my room. I needed to eat, even if I had no appetite. The hallway was still, and for a second, I wondered if he had left. I tiptoed down the stairs, absurdly cautious, like a teenager sneaking around her parents. The kitchen smelled of toasted bread and cinnamon. He was there. Of course he was. He didn't look surprised when he saw me, just nodded gently and gestured to the plate on the table. 2 slices of toast, an orange cut into neat wedges, and tea already steeping in my favorite cup. I made extra, he said. I nodded, murmured thanks, and sat down. We ate mostly in silence. Every sound felt amplified, the clink of the spoon, the soft crunch of toast, the distant hum of the refrigerator. At one point, he asked me if I had plans for the day, and I answered too quickly, saying I needed to organize the linen closet, which wasn't remotely urgent. He smiled politely but didn't press further. After breakfast, we drifted into our respective corners of the house, both pretending to be busy. I went to the upstairs closet and actually pulled out the linens, more for the sake of movement than any real need. I folded and refolded towels, rearranged shelves that didn't need rearranging, all while fighting the lingering feeling in my body, that strange awareness of being remembered by someone else's touch. In the early afternoon, I ventured outside. The backyard had always been my escape. The roses needed trimming, and I welcomed the excuse to be in the sun. The shears felt good in my hands, purposeful, clean. Something simple that made sense. Cut what is dead, what no longer blooms, to give room for life. As I worked, I heard the back door open behind me. I didn't look up. He didn't say anything right away, just stepped onto the porch and leaned against the post, watching me. "You're good at that," he said eventually. I shrugged. "It's just practice." "No, I mean, making things better. Even in small ways." I didn't answer. I clipped another stem and let the dried bloom fall to the ground. He walked down the steps and joined me at the edge of the garden. For a few minutes, he didn't speak, just knelt to help gather the trimmings. I should have told him I didn't need help. I should have reminded him of boundaries. But the words never came. Instead, we worked in tandem, moving slowly from one bush to the next. Our hands occasionally brushed, and each time felt like a ripple through water, subtle but undeniable. At one point, I reached for the same branch he was holding, and our fingers met. Neither of us moved away right away. His hand was warm, steady. Mine trembled slightly. Eventually, I stood up, brushing soil from my knees, and said I needed to check on laundry. It was the first excuse I could think of, and I fled inside as if chased by something I didn't dare name. In the laundry room, I gripped the edge of the counter and stared at the spinning machine, my chest tight. I didn't understand what was happening to me. I didn't understand what I wanted. It wasn't about being reckless or betraying vows, it was something deeper. Something rooted in loneliness. In years of being dismissed and unheard. That evening, I prepared dinner alone. My husband had texted earlier to say he would be home late tomorrow instead. A delay. Another extension of his absence that had already become the norm. I didn't respond. What was there to say? Dinner was quiet again. He offered to do the dishes, and I let him, retreating to the living room with a glass of water I didn't really want. I sat on the couch and turned on the television without watching it. The volume was low. Just background sound, something to distract from my racing thoughts. He came in after a while and sat in the armchair across from me. He didn't look at the screen either. "I'm sorry," he said, not loud. I looked over. "For what?" He hesitated. "For making things strange." I nodded, swallowing hard. "It's not just you." His eyes met mine, and we sat like that for a long time, saying nothing more. When I finally went to bed, the sheets felt cold. I lay awake again, staring into the dark, unsure of how I'd arrived at this place. Not just the kiss. Not just him. But everything, the quiet unraveling of a life I had worked so hard to hold together. Somewhere in the house, I heard footsteps. Slow, careful. They stopped outside my door. My breath caught. But the door never opened. After a moment, the sound faded away again. I turned to my side and closed my eyes, but rest didn't come. There was only the echo of that pause outside the door, and the knowledge that I had invited something in, not just him, but a part of myself I hadn't known was still alive. The next day began the same way the last one ended, quiet, deliberate, slow. I moved through the morning as though my limbs had grown heavier overnight. Every task required more effort than it should have, brushing my hair, pouring cereal, folding the blanket over the back of the couch. Even my thoughts felt sluggish, dragged down by a weight I couldn't name aloud. He was already gone when I came down the stairs. I found a note on the kitchen counter in his handwriting, scribbled quickly on a torn piece of paper. Went for a run. Back soon. I stared at it for a long time, wondering what kind of person left notes like that in a house where they were technically just a guest. It wasn't inappropriate. But it felt intimate. Not in its words, but in its simplicity. A gesture made for me and no one else. I carried the note with me as I wandered into the backyard. The air was cool for late morning, the kind of crispness that makes your skin wake up before your mind does. I sat on the old wooden bench by the roses, the same one my husband had built years ago when he still cared about making things for us. The paint had faded and the wood creaked, but it held me all the same. I folded the note and slid it into my pocket. After a while, I returned inside and stood at the kitchen sink, rinsing a glass I hadn't even used. It was something to do. Something that gave the illusion of routine. That was when the door opened. He walked in, cheeks flushed from the cold, damp hair curling slightly around his temples. His shirt clung to his chest and back, and I looked away before I could be caught noticing. "Morning," he said. His voice was still a little breathless. "Morning," I replied, reaching for a dish towel to dry my hands even though they weren't wet. We didn't say anything more. He poured himself a glass of water and leaned against the counter, watching me with an expression I couldn't quite decipher. Not longing. Not regret. Just presence. I found it hard to hold his gaze. Later that afternoon, I walked to the small market a few blocks away. I didn't need groceries, but I needed the walk. The fresh air, the physical distance. I needed to feel like I had control over something, even if it was just the weight of the tote bag on my shoulder. I wandered the aisles without purpose, letting my fingers graze over rows of canned beans and boxes of tea. A cashier smiled at me, and I returned it mechanically. I didn't belong to this place anymore. Or maybe I never did. When I returned home, the house was quiet again. He was in the living room, headphones on, laptop open in front of him. He didn't see me pass behind him, and I didn't interrupt. I climbed the stairs and shut myself in the bedroom, letting the silence wrap around me like an old coat. Worn, but familiar. In the evening, he asked if I wanted to watch something, just a movie, nothing special. I hesitated but agreed. The alternative was another hour alone with my thoughts, and I wasn't sure I could endure that again. We didn't sit close, but the space between us was thinner than usual. The kind of space that electricity knows how to fill. I can't even remember what we watched. Something forgettable. The kind of film that fades the moment the credits roll. But what I remember is the rhythm of his breathing. The way he leaned slightly forward when he laughed. The way he passed me the remote as if I mattered. When the movie ended, I stood to leave. My legs felt unsteady, as though I'd forgotten how to walk normally. He stood too, and for a brief moment, we were face to face in the middle of the room. "I don't know what this is," I said, the words escaping before I could stop them. His eyes didn't waver. Me neither. I waited for more, but he didn't add anything. There was no explanation. No grand confession. Just that. Me neither. And somehow, that felt more honest than anything I'd heard in years. I nodded and turned away, climbing the stairs slowly, each step heavier than the last. In my room, I sat on the edge of the bed, fingers curled around the edge of the blanket, staring at the floor. The shadows shifted as the sun dipped lower, filling the room with an amber hue that made everything feel both tender and fragile. I thought of my husband, still away, probably eating alone in a hotel restaurant, reading emails between bites of overcooked steak. I thought of how far apart we had drifted, how long I'd convinced myself that silence was normal. That night, I didn't sleep again. I lay still, eyes wide open, waiting for something, anything, to make this make sense. But nothing came. Just the sound of his footsteps in the hallway. Slower than before. Stopping outside my door again. A breath held. Then gone. The following morning began with an unusual brightness, the kind that slips through closed curtains and lands directly across your face, forcing your eyes open before your mind is ready. I blinked into the soft light and listened. The house was still. Not silent, just still, like it was holding its breath. I sat up slowly, my body stiff from the weight of another sleepless night, and pulled a sweater over my shoulders. Downstairs, the kettle was already warm. He had been up before me again. I found a cup of tea waiting, the steam still curling like a question in the air. I didn't hear him enter, but I sensed him before I turned around. He was standing in the doorway, hands in the pockets of his hoodie, his eyes searching my face for something unspoken. We didn't exchange good mornings. There was no need. The greeting was in the tea, in the quiet, in the space we shared without crossing. I sipped slowly and looked out the window, pretending the garden was more interesting than the memory that clung to the back of my throat like a secret. Later that day, I went to the small bookstore downtown. I hadn't been there in years, not since the owners changed and replaced all the chairs with uncomfortable metal stools. But I needed air, and I needed to see myself doing something normal. I bought a book I didn't really want to read and browsed aimlessly until my legs began to ache from standing. On the walk home, I passed by a flower shop. A display of tulips caught my attention, soft yellow petals, the color of early spring. I stood there longer than necessary, remembering how my husband used to bring me flowers without reason. Before anniversaries were just calendar entries, before love became maintenance. I didn't go in. I didn't need tulips. I just needed to remember that once, I had mattered in someone's eyes in a way that didn't feel heavy. When I returned home, he was on the couch, sketching something in a notebook. I had never asked what he drew in there. Maybe because I was afraid of the answer. Maybe because I didn't want to know if it wasn't me. But today, I sat in the armchair across from him and let the silence stretch. We didn't talk. We didn't need to. There was a mutual agreement in the way we avoided looking at each other too long, as if we both knew that eye contact might lead to more than either of us was ready to handle. I stayed in that room for hours, pretending to read the book I had just bought. The words swam on the page, refusing to settle into sentences. My mind wandered, looping back to the memory of the kiss. Not because it was a violation, but because it wasn't. It hadn't felt wrong in the moment. That was the part that troubled me most. Evening came quietly. He asked if I wanted to go for a walk. I hesitated before saying yes. The air had cooled, and a soft breeze rustled the trees as we made our way down the familiar path behind the neighborhood. The same path my husband and I had walked dozens of times before life became too noisy, too tired, too full of unsaid things. We didn't touch. Not even accidentally. But our steps matched, our breath synced. That strange comfort returned, the kind that creeps in when you stop resisting it. At one point, he pointed to the sky where the clouds had split just enough to let the moon shine through. I used to think the moon was sad, he said, voice barely above a whisper. I glanced at him. Why? Because it only ever shows one face. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said nothing. We walked on, side by side, not speaking again until we reached the edge of the field where the houses ended. When we returned home, I found a small envelope sitting on the kitchen table. My name was written on it in my husband's handwriting. Inside was a folded card with a perfume advertisement, the same brand he had bought me the year we married. A note was scrawled on the back, "Thought you might want a new bottle. Yours is running low." I stared at it, fingers tightening around the edge of the card. I hadn't worn that perfume in years. Not since the scent began to remind me of being someone I no longer felt like. He hadn't noticed. Or maybe he had and didn't care. I placed the card on the counter and left it there. Upstairs, I opened my closet and pulled out the dress I hadn't worn in months. It was soft, light, not meant for impressing anyone. Just for feeling like myself. I let my fingers trail over the fabric before hanging it back. It wasn't time yet. That night, we sat in the living room again. The movie played in the background, but neither of us watched. I looked over once and found him already looking at me. And in that quiet, in that pause heavy with everything we weren't saying, we kissed. We kissed. It was gentle. Not rushed. Not desperate. Just real. When it ended, we didn't speak. He stood and walked away, leaving me alone with the echo of it, with the truth of it. I didn't go to bed right away. I sat there, staring at nothing, my heart steady and uncertain all at once. The house felt different now. Not better. Not worse. Just changed. And so was I. The following days passed like pages in a book I wasn't sure I wanted to keep reading, quietly, without punctuation, each moment blending into the next. There was no dramatic shift, no confrontation or confessions, just a subtle current running beneath everything. The kind of current that moves slowly but has the power to change landscapes over time. We didn't talk about the kiss. We didn't reference it, didn't revisit the moment, didn't name it. But it lingered between us like a scent on fabric, faint, persistent, impossible to wash away completely. Every glance was heavier. Every silence felt rehearsed. And though nothing was said aloud, everything was understood. My husband returned late in the afternoon 2 days after the kiss. He came through the door with the same quiet energy he always carried when coming back from a trip, tired but functional, like a man moving through a life that no longer excited him. He kissed my cheek absently, set down his suitcase, and asked if the heat had been working all right. I told him it had. He nodded and moved on. That night, we sat at the dinner table as we always did when he was home, the three of us forming an awkward triangle of mismatched intentions. My husband asked about errands, the weather, a news story he had read on the plane. I answered politely, measured. The boy said very little. His words were shorter now, chosen more carefully, his gaze lowered more often. I wondered if my husband noticed, but he didn't comment. He rarely did. After dinner, I washed the dishes slowly, my hands submerged in the warm water longer than they needed to be. I watched soap swirl in spirals around the plates, as if they were trying to slip away from responsibility. He dried quietly beside me, offering the occasional dish towel with mechanical efficiency. Later, I folded laundry while the television played in the background. My husband had fallen asleep on the couch, his head tilted back, mouth slightly open. The blanket I'd placed over his legs had slipped to the floor. I picked it up and draped it back over him, watching him breathe for a few seconds before turning away. There was a time I would have kissed his forehead in that moment. Now, I couldn't even remember what that felt like. Upstairs, I passed the guest room and paused. The door was ajar, the light inside faint. I didn't go in. I kept walking. The next morning, I found a woman's bracelet on the passenger seat of my husband's car. I had gone out early to move it from the driveway so I could trim the hedges. It was a delicate chain, silver, with a tiny heart-shaped charm. Not mine. Not anything I recognized. I held it between my fingers, feeling the weight of the metal, the coolness of it. There was a small knot where the clasp had once broken and been repaired, suggesting time, familiarity, care. I didn't mention it when I handed him the keys later. He didn't notice that anything was different. Or if he did, he didn't let it show. That afternoon, he left again for a weekend golf trip with his colleagues, and as he rolled his suitcase toward the car, I stood at the door watching him, trying to remember the last time I had asked where exactly he was going, or cared. When the car disappeared down the street, I closed the door and leaned against it, feeling the wood press into my spine like a reminder of everything I'd allowed to harden inside me. The silence in the house shifted again. Not heavier. Not lighter. Just different. Like something returning to its original shape after being bent for too long. He found me in the garden later, kneeling in the dirt beside the rosemary bush. I hadn't heard him come outside, but I didn't flinch when he spoke. "You okay?" he asked softly. "I don't know," I said. He sat on the edge of the stone path, elbows on his knees. We didn't speak for a while. The wind picked up slightly, carrying the scent of soil and crushed leaves. It felt honest, at least. The earth doesn't pretend. I told him about the bracelet, not directly, just that I had found something in the car that wasn't mine. He didn't look surprised. He didn't even look at me. Just nodded, slowly. "I figured," he said. It was all he said. And it was all I needed. That evening, the boy offered to cook. I let him. I sat at the table and watched as he moved through the kitchen with quiet competence. He asked where we kept the rosemary. I pointed to the windowsill. He smiled and thanked me. I watched his hands as he chopped, stirred, plated. They were careful, thoughtful. Every gesture was considered. The meal was simple, but good. Better than anything I had made in weeks. He said very little as we ate, and neither did I. The silence between us wasn't uncomfortable anymore, it was filled with things we didn't need to name. I wondered if he was as aware of them as I was, or if his mind had already moved on. Youth has a way of shedding guilt faster than age does. After dinner, we sat on the back porch. The sun had almost disappeared, leaving only the last sliver of light over the horizon. I wrapped a shawl around my shoulders and leaned back against the chair, breathing in the evening air. He sat beside me, a careful distance apart. We talked about small things, books, music, places we'd both been separately. At one point, I told him a story about a trip I'd taken years ago, back when I was still trying to surprise my husband with spontaneous getaways. He listened intently, nodding in the right places, smiling at the funny parts. I didn't tell him that the trip had ended in silence, that my husband had been more interested in his phone than the mountains. Eventually, he turned toward me and said, "You deserved more." It wasn't a grand statement. Just 3 words, spoken without pity or agenda. But they lodged themselves in my chest like a seed dropped into fertile soil. We didn't touch that night. We didn't even say goodnight. But I knew then, whatever happened next, I couldn't go back to pretending. The kiss had opened a door. The bracelet had shattered an illusion. And now, I was standing in the hallway between 2 lives, unsure of which one I wanted to enter. But at least I wasn't asleep anymore. The morning after he left for his trip, I found myself waking earlier than usual. The house felt hollow without the usual clatter of his suitcase wheels against the tile, without the habitual thud of the front door closing behind him. For once, I didn't rush to fill the silence. I let it stretch. I let it breathe. And somewhere in that space, I felt the pulse of my own thoughts, uninterrupted, clear. I moved slowly through my routines, not because I lacked energy, but because I wanted to feel each motion. I washed the breakfast dishes by hand, even though the dishwasher was empty. I arranged the fruit in the bowl by color, not necessity. I watered the plants one by one, whispering nothing in particular as I touched their leaves. By mid-morning, I found myself standing at my bedroom closet, looking at clothes I hadn't worn in years. Not because they were out of fashion, but because I had outgrown the woman I'd been in them. Still, I reached for a soft blouse, pale blue and untouched for too long. I ran my fingers along the stitching and wondered who I had been the last time I wore it. Not this. Not this version of myself. I changed without thinking and brushed my hair with care. Not for him. Not even for the boy in the guest room. But for the me I kept forgetting existed. Later that day, I baked. It was the sort of impulse I hadn't acted on in years. I pulled out the flour and sugar and opened the recipe book with the faded cover. My hands moved from memory, not instructions. The scent of cinnamon and butter slowly filled the house, warm and nostalgic. It reminded me of earlier years, when things were simpler, when effort and love were still the same thing. He found me in the kitchen as I was setting the tray on the counter to cool. "You bake?" he asked with a quiet smile. I nodded, surprised I didn't feel embarrassed. "Used to. It's been a while." He took one and bit into it without waiting for it to cool. I winced, waiting for his reaction, but he closed his eyes for a moment and said, "Perfect." I smiled, and for the first time in days, it didn't feel weighted with guilt. That afternoon, we drove out of town. The idea had been his. Just a small coastal trail, something not too far, not too crowded. I agreed, perhaps too quickly, craving the sensation of motion, of forwardness, even if it was only physical. The road wound gently along the hills, flanked by dry grass and scattered trees. I kept one hand on the window frame, feeling the wind against my skin. It was a strange sensation, freedom wrapped in something fragile. The hike itself was modest, a shaded trail through tall pines that opened to a cliffside view of the water below. We didn't talk much on the way up. The rhythm of our footsteps was conversation enough. I liked the way he occasionally turned back to check if I was keeping up, but never slowed in a patronizing way. It was small, but it mattered. At the top, we sat on a bench overlooking the bay. The sky had turned a soft, milky gray, and the waves below moved without urgency. He handed me a bottle of water, then rested his arms on his knees, looking out. "It's easy to forget how quiet the world can be," he said. I nodded. "It's the noise inside that's harder to silence." He didn't ask what I meant. I didn't offer more. We stayed there for a long time, just sitting, just breathing. The space between us was not crowded with tension or words. It simply existed. On the way back, we took the long road. He played music through the car's speakers, soft, instrumental pieces that didn't demand attention. I watched the horizon shift through the windshield, and for a moment, I imagined not returning home at all. Not running away, but starting over. Not as punishment. As choice. When we pulled into the driveway, dusk had already begun to settle. The porch light flickered on automatically. We walked up the steps slowly, neither of us ready for the moment to end. Inside, he turned on the lamp in the living room and then paused, looking at me across the space we'd come to share without meaning to. "I'll go pack some of my things," he said gently, not as a question, not as an assumption. I looked at him then, really looked. I thought about the silence that filled my marriage. The absence that passed for peace. The meals eaten in parallel. The wordless nights and the weight of being untouched. I thought about the kiss, about the way it hadn't felt stolen or wrong. About the bracelet I'd found in my husband's car. About all the ways I'd been taught to tolerate, to endure. And then I thought about now. About the bench on the trail. The cookies in the kitchen. The blouse I'd chosen this morning not for anyone else, but because it reminded me of a time when I wanted to feel. I met his eyes, and I said the only thing that felt honest. We spent the night together. The morning after was not cinematic. There were no poetic sunbeams cutting through linen curtains, no birds singing from the trees outside. Just the ordinary light of a Tuesday morning, flat and unforgiving, casting sharp edges on everything it touched. I opened my eyes slowly, unsure what I expected to feel, shame, maybe, or regret, but what I felt instead was stillness. A quiet that wasn't empty. A kind of clarity I hadn't felt in years. He was gone from the room. I could tell from the silence. There was no scent of his cologne, no sound of soft breathing. Just the slight indentation on the pillow beside mine, proof that the night hadn't been imagined. I sat up, pulled the blanket around my shoulders, and waited. For what, I didn't know. A sign? A collapse? A surge of guilt strong enough to undo everything? But none came. My thoughts were slow, methodical, like a clock ticking through its routine. No panic. No hysteria. Just reality, as it stood, unchanged by the fact that I had finally crossed the invisible line I'd been walking for weeks. Downstairs, the house hummed with its usual morning sounds, the low buzz of the refrigerator, the tick of the wall clock, the whisper of wind against the windows. I found him in the kitchen, already dressed, already composed. He didn't look surprised to see me, just nodded once in greeting and poured an extra cup of coffee. We sat across from each other at the table. Not speaking. Not avoiding. Just breathing in the same space. There was no need to revisit the night. It had already done its work. He left shortly after, saying he needed to clear his head. I didn't ask where he was going. I didn't want to attach expectations to the quiet that had finally settled inside me. I spent the day in fragments, small, ordinary actions pulled together by muscle memory. I changed the bedsheets, watered the plants, swept the front porch. I folded laundry that didn't need folding and rearranged books on the shelf by color instead of title. I didn't cry. I didn't sit down and fall apart. I moved. By mid-afternoon, I found myself standing in the hallway outside my husband's office, staring at the closed door as if it might open on its own. He wasn't due back until the evening. But the room still smelled faintly of his cologne, that sharp, clean scent I used to find comforting. Now it felt like a signature on a letter I hadn't read. On his desk was a neat stack of papers, his planner, and the watch he never wore but couldn't throw away. I reached for the top drawer, almost without thought, and paused. Then I opened it. Inside, alongside pens and receipts, was a card. Plain, white, no name on the front. I turned it over. It was an appointment reminder. Not from a doctor or dentist, but from a jewelry store. A pickup confirmation, dated 2 weeks prior. The bracelet. My chest tightened, not from jealousy, but from the bitter familiarity of it all. He had made space for someone else long before I had. He had found his own way to feel alive again, while I remained anchored to the routine, the loyalty, the hope that something might return. I closed the drawer gently and walked away. When evening came, I cooked dinner. Not because I wanted to, but because I didn't know what else to do. The kitchen had always been my space, even when no one noticed the effort. I roasted vegetables, made rice, set the table for 3. He returned just before 7. I heard the car door shut, the click of the key in the lock. He stepped inside without calling out, as he always did. I greeted him from the kitchen. He looked tired. Not from travel, but from something deeper, the kind of exhaustion that clings to a person's posture. He said the trip had been fine, that traffic was worse than expected. He asked what smelled so good. Dinner, I said. We sat together. The three of us. The meal passed with surface-level conversation. He talked about a coworker's retirement. The boy mentioned a news article he'd read that morning. I nodded at the right times, smiled when appropriate. It felt like theater, like we were performing a scene we'd all rehearsed before. Afterward, my husband went to the living room and turned on the television. He didn't ask about my day. He never did anymore. And I didn't offer. I found myself outside, standing barefoot in the garden, the grass cool against my skin. The sky was dark, stars barely visible through the haze. I looked up, not for answers, but for proof that something was still vast and unknowable. He found me there. He didn't speak, just stood beside me, hands in his pockets. The silence stretched comfortably. I didn't move away. I don't know how long we stood like that. Eventually, I said, he doesn't ask where I go anymore. He didn't ask who I meant. He didn't need to. He doesn't ask what I think. Or what I feel. Still, he said nothing. I turned to him. What does that say? He met my gaze. It says he let go before you did. There was no pity in his voice. No judgment. Just truth. The wind picked up slightly, brushing hair across my face. I didn't reach to fix it. I let it stay wild. When I went inside, my husband was asleep on the couch, remote balanced on his chest. The TV played softly, casting flickering light across the room. I watched him for a moment. His face was peaceful. Detached. I walked past him, up the stairs, and into my room. I closed the door behind me. And for the first time in a long time, I didn't feel the need to explain myself to anyone. The days that followed moved differently. Not faster or slower, but with a kind of looseness, like a clock whose hands kept turning but had stopped counting anything real. I found myself outside more often, clipping dead leaves, wiping down the garden furniture, brushing fallen petals from the brick steps. The physical tasks helped me think without thinking, to let thoughts rise and fall without needing to hold on to any of them. He kept his distance. Not coldly, not out of shame. More like someone who understood the importance of silence and how it allows things to settle. We rarely spoke. But when we did, it was soft, brief, and never about that night. I appreciated that more than I could say. My husband, meanwhile, returned to his routine as if nothing had changed. He asked about errands, whether the mailbox had been checked, if I remembered to defrost the chicken for dinner. I responded with the same neutrality he had taught me over the years. There was a rhythm between us, predictable and empty. And in that space, I finally began to see how long I had been performing normalcy rather than living it. One morning, I woke to the sound of a delivery truck. I looked out the window and saw a small package on the front steps. I didn't remember ordering anything. When I opened it, I found a set of earrings, gold, understated, elegant. The kind I used to wear when we still went to parties together. The card inside was unsigned. No note, just the earrings. I held them in my palm for a long time, letting the metal warm to my skin. Then I placed them back in the box and closed the lid. He didn't mention them, and I didn't ask. Later that afternoon, I received a message from a friend I hadn't seen in months. She wanted to meet for coffee. I almost said no, but something inside me, maybe the part that was tired of hiding, said yes. We met at a small cafe near the park. She greeted me with the same warmth she always had, though her eyes lingered a little longer on mine, like she was trying to figure out what had changed. We talked about surface things at first, children, the rising price of groceries, a local store that had gone out of business. Then, gently, she asked how I was. Fine, I said. Too quickly. She waited, sipping her tea, giving me space. I don't know, I admitted. I feel like I'm finally seeing things clearly. But I don't know what to do with that clarity. She reached across the table, placing her hand lightly over mine. You always had clarity, she said. You just stopped trusting it. That night, I lay awake for hours, staring at the ceiling, hearing her words over and over in my mind. I thought about all the times I had second-guessed myself, had silenced the voice that said, "This isn't enough." I had built my identity around being steady, loyal, agreeable. I had mistaken endurance for love. The next morning, I found a note by the coffee pot. It was in his handwriting, the boy's. Just a simple line, going out for a few days. Don't worry. I reread it several times. There was no explanation, no location, no promise of return. But there was care in the way he had written "don't worry," as if he understood the weight of being left without warning. I didn't feel abandoned. I felt something else, unmoored, maybe, but not afraid. There was freedom in the quiet. For the first time in months, I opened the large linen closet in the hallway and began sorting. I made piles, keep, donate, throw away. Each towel, each set of sheets, each unused blanket felt like a chapter one was finally choosing to close. I cleared space not out of anger, but necessity. I needed room. Not for someone new. For myself. A few days passed. I spent time walking, reading, even cooking meals I actually enjoyed. My husband noticed, in the shallow way he noticed everything. You seem lighter, he said one evening. I didn't respond. Because he wasn't wrong. And because he wouldn't have understood. Then one afternoon, he approached me in the kitchen as I was putting away dishes. He asked if I had time to talk. I turned off the water and faced him. I've been thinking, he said. About us. I waited. I know I haven't been the most attentive husband, he continued. And I know you've been distant lately. But maybe we could try to reset. It was the first time in years he had used the word "we" in relation to anything emotional. Why now? I asked. He shrugged. Because I don't want to lose what we had. The truth settled in my chest like a stone. We already lost it, I said quietly. We've just been pretending otherwise. He looked away then, his eyes scanning the countertop as if searching for something to anchor him. He didn't ask for details. Maybe he didn't want them. Maybe he already knew. I don't hate you, I said, surprising myself. But I can't go back. He nodded once, slowly. There was no argument. No outburst. Just the subtle collapse of something that had been teetering for far too long. That night, I didn't cry. I sat on the porch with a blanket around my shoulders, watching the moon rise. And for the first time in what felt like a lifetime, I wasn't waiting for anything or anyone. I was simply there. Present. Still. The house was quieter now. Not because people spoke less, but because something fundamental had shifted beneath the walls. The tension had unraveled, not violently, not with some explosive end, but gently, as if the string had finally worn too thin to hold its own weight. My husband no longer tried to reach me with empty questions. The rhythm of our interactions had become sparse but polite, like distant neighbors passing each other on a morning walk. There was no bitterness in it, just a quiet acknowledgement that the life we'd built was no longer one we lived in together. I began waking up earlier. Not because I had to, but because I wanted to be alone with the dawn. There was something honest about the early light, the way it poured through the windows without asking permission. It reminded me that time was still moving, that endings could carry with them a kind of peace if I was willing to let them. I spent most mornings in the garden, pruning and watering, pulling weeds with bare hands and dirt under my nails. I liked the feeling of the earth. It didn't ask for explanations. It didn't need apologies. It only required presence, patience, and care, 3 things I had once given away freely and without condition. Sometimes my husband would leave for the day without saying goodbye. Sometimes he'd nod once from the hallway, briefcase in hand, and I'd offer a small smile in return. There was no ceremony to our coexistence anymore. Just 2 people who had once tried and, over time, stopped trying. The boy returned on a Thursday. I was sitting on the back steps, sipping tea and watching the sky when I heard the car door close. He didn't ring the bell or knock. He opened the gate and stepped into the yard like he had never left. Like the silence between us hadn't grown day by day since he'd gone. I didn't stand. I didn't speak right away. He approached slowly, not with hesitation but with the kind of carefulness reserved for someone who knows what has changed and doesn't want to step on anything fragile. "I wasn't sure you'd want to see me," he said. "I wasn't sure I would either," I replied, my voice calm, level. He nodded and sat beside me, leaving just enough space for the breeze to move between us. "I needed time," he said. "To think. To understand what that night meant. What any of this means." I didn't look at him. I watched a bird land on the fence, pause, and then fly away. "I didn't regret it," I said. "But I also didn't expect it to solve anything." "It didn't," he admitted. "But it made everything clearer." We sat for a while longer in silence. He told me about the few days he spent at a friend's cabin, no cell reception, no distractions. He read, walked, cooked his own meals. He said he thought about me. About us. About the version of us that only existed between the lines, in quiet spaces and unspoken glances. I listened. Not because I needed reassurance. But because it was the first time someone had offered their truth without expecting mine in return. When he asked if I was okay, I didn't lie. "I'm not sure," I said. "But I think I'm getting closer." That night, I made dinner for 1. My husband had a work dinner, or at least that's what he said when he left. I didn't question it. I didn't care to. I ate by the window, watching the streetlights flicker on one by one, the neighborhood sliding gently into darkness. The food was warm, simple, satisfying. I finished my plate without rushing, then washed the dishes in silence, letting the rhythm of the water lull my thoughts. Later, I sat at my writing desk and opened an old notebook. I used to write more lists, letters, pieces of reflection that never went anywhere but helped me understand where I was. The pages were yellowed now, some filled, some blank. I turned to a fresh one and picked up a pen. I wrote about the garden. About the way the rosemary had started to bloom again. About how the air smelled different in the early morning. About the feeling of peeling back layers and not being afraid of what lay beneath. I didn't write about the kiss. Or the night. Or the moment I realized I no longer loved my husband in the way I had once promised. Those things had already written themselves into the shape of my days. The next week, we met with a mediator. My husband didn't argue. He was calm, detached, businesslike. We split things evenly, with little resistance. There were no raised voices. No tears. Just the quiet undoing of a contract we had outgrown. "I don't blame you," he said as we left. "I know," I replied. "I don't blame you either." He moved out a few weeks later. I helped him pack. Not because I wanted to, but because it felt right to end things with decency. He took the couch he liked, the coffee maker, a few framed photographs. I kept the house. Not because I needed it, but because I wanted to see if it could become mine again. The boy didn't move back in. He came by sometimes, once for coffee, another time to help me fix a leaky faucet. But there were no expectations, no whispered promises of a future tied to the past. We were kind to each other. And for now, that was enough. I spent more time alone. Not lonely, alone. I read books without checking the time. I repainted the guest room. I planted more flowers. I walked barefoot across the kitchen floor in the middle of the night just because I could. Some nights, I still lay awake, staring at the ceiling, wondering how things could have gone differently. But those thoughts no longer scared me. They passed like clouds. Momentary. Harmless. And every morning, without fail, I stood in the garden, coffee in hand, breathing in the scent of the day. Alive. Present. Exactly where I needed to be.